I found a piece of wood in the pile. It's 8 3/4 wide, so I should be able to get 4 2-inch strips out of that, leaving a little bit of room for the blade to use up the remaining 3/4 inch. And I'm just checking this to make sure it's pretty straight. This straightness is less important because it's going to get run over the jointer anyway. As I go over the jointer, when the board is on this side, I push down on here. When I get to the other side, I want to push down on here. And that helps to straighten out if the bottom edge is not already straight. So that could use another pass to get it really perfect, but I'm not going to waste any more wood because when it gets cut with the table saw, the strip of wood that comes off may warp a bit anyway, and so then it needs another run over. But I'll just do a check here to make sure things are good and straight, there's no rocking. Another thing I want to show at this time is the difference between the grain on the edge, which you can see is very straight. That's the grain we'll see on the front of the frame, versus the grain on the sides, which is very variable. That's simply because of the way boards come out of the tree. There you can see the rings of the tree, and so on the edges here, when you cut it, you get nice, dense, close together grain, whereas on the surfaces it's changing as the radius comes up. So depending whatever effect you want, you can cut the frame out of different parts of the wood. The effect I'm looking for is straight grains on the front, so it doesn't distract from the art. I'm using a thin kerf blade, a 0.1 inch kerf. That's to minimize the wasted wood as I do the cuts. My little handy blade guard on. Make sure it's lined up with the blade. The first cut I do, I'll cut it right down the center rather than taking strips off. That'll release any major stresses that are in the wood. If it's going to warp, it can do its warping. I'm going to use these push sticks to keep my fingers away from the blade. This one I'll grab on here so I can get a good downward and forward force without getting anywhere near the blade. And this one I'll use here to keep it pushed into the fence. So I'm going to line up the fence to get the blade in line with my center. As I make that final push through on the cut, using this sideways push stick is no use because I'd just be pushing the extra piece into the blade. What I'm able to do is get 3 directions of force. One is obviously pushing this way, the other is pushing down into the table a bit, and the other is actually pushing towards the fence. So now let's do a check with a straight edge to see how much stress relief we got on the wood. Looks pretty good. If the wood does bend a lot after cutting, just stack it together, clamp it, and let it dry for a few weeks. That'll sometimes bring it back, and at least it will stabilize the moisture content so that when I make the remaining cuts and finishing on the planer, it's not going to then continue warping when it's built into the frame. Since this piece is just a little high in the center, I'm going to run the center part over the jointer before I do the ends. I'm starting with the cutter partway in. See how we did? Perfect. And our other piece, which I have not run through the jointer, is already perfect. The next step is to cut each of these pieces in half to get the 2-inch strips for the frame. But before I do that, I'll cut off just the length I need, actually 3 inches longer than what I need, so that'll leave me a scrap of wood that might be useful in another project, rather than 2 scraps of wood if I made the long cut first. I've checked the grain on the edge to decide where I want to make the cut, which piece of end I want to cut off, depending on what has the nicest looking straightest grain. Doesn't really matter what saw I use to cut this off with, just a rough cut. I'll use a jigsaw because it's handy and lightweight. This is the piece for the top and bottom of the frame. It's shorter than the others, so I get a bigger piece of scrap. I've marked the center of the piece of wood again, and that's giving me about 2 1/8 inches. So I will be able to end up with a full 2-inch wide frame when I'm done. Finding that there's not really enough room between the fence and the blade guard, so I will remove the blade guard, which is not as reckless as it may seem, because my hands will be well away from the blade. I'll have the blade just sticking up 1/4 of an inch above the wood. Having cut the wood again, there's another chance that it could have reacted and become warped. Light amount there, nothing serious. Good. So the next step will be to get one edge dead flat. It's a good idea to read the direction of the grain to decide what's the best direction to pass the wood over the jointer. Here we can see the grain is coming up on a rise slightly. As the jointer blades spin in this direction, if the wood was inclined to tear out, it's going to tear out along the grain and take out a bigger chunk. If I feed in this way, the grain is coming down, blades are spinning. If the wood's inclined to tear out, it'll be a small tear out because it'll follow the grain downward. So that's the preferred direction to go. The other thing I have to decide at this time is whether this side or this side will be the outer exposed surface of the frame. So if one of these was cleaner, free of knot holes or blemishes, then I would choose that side. All 4 boards have been run over the jointer to get a smooth, flat surface. So now we're going to go through the thickness planer to get the other surface parallel with that surface. I'm not going to bring it down to the final 3/4 inch thickness because we want to get this 1/4 inch by 1 inch spacer piece out of the amount that's cut out of here. And I need to leave some room for the thickness of the blade, which is going to use up some wood. So I'll just run all 4 boards through the thickness planer to get them to the same thickness, something greater than 3/4 inch. As I pass each board through the planer, I want to be checking the grain direction again, making sure it's going up, because this time the cutter heads are at the top. They're spinning this way, so if there's any inclination to tear out, it'll follow the grain upward and be a small tear out. First pass through the planer, I'll start with the head up high. I'll slowly lower it till it just starts cutting, and then go down a little more to get them fairly flat. Now that we got two parallel surfaces on each piece, we're back to the jointer to get a straight edge here that's at 90 degrees to those surfaces. So I'll be keeping the wood pushed up against the fence, which is 90 degrees to the table. I check each piece against the straight edge before taking it to the table saw. Now I've set the fence 2 inches from the inside of the blade for the final cut. I put an X on the side that I didn't run over the jointer. I know what the good edge is, and I'll put that edge against the fence. And I'll mark the edge again that went against the blade because it's not as smooth as the edge that was on the jointer.